Nuclear saber-rattling is an extremely rare event in geopolitics and rightfully draws outsized attention. Ukraine is currently fighting the unprovoked invasion of Russia, the country with the world's biggest arsenal of nuclear weapons. Ever since stalling in Ukraine, many Russian politicians and public figures, most importantly Vladimir Putin, have implied the use of nuclear weapons. Understandably, it is causing a major concern for everyone worldwide, since nobody wants to die in a nuclear apocalypse. But is the Russian nuclear threat real? I'm your host David, and this week we are looking at Russia's nuclear threat. This is the post-Cold War. If we are talking about serious offensives related to trying to recover Crimea by force, it is fully obvious that this will be considered a reason to use any means, including those provided for in the doctrine of nuclear deterrents. Every day when they provide Ukraine with foreign weapons brings the nuclear apocalypse closer. Dmitry Medvedev, former president of Russia, the deputy chief of the Security Council. Arguments that the nuclear powers have not previously used weapons of mass destruction in local conflicts are untenable. This is because these states have not faced a situation in which the security of their citizens and the territorial integrity of their countries were threatened. Vyacheslav Volodin, chairman of the Russian State Duma. I firmly believe that nuclear war is inevitable. I am deeply convinced of this. I believe that we should withdraw from the treaty of a moratorium on the testing of nuclear weapons in all environments. We need to test nuclear weapons so the West can see that they exist and see how powerful they are, and give an ultimatum to the NATO countries by targeting our nuclear strategic forces on government headquarters and on launch sites of those countries that have nuclear capabilities. They are supporting a Nazi regime and we have to put an ultimatum. If they don't want to hear it, that means there will be no more London, no more Berlin, no more Paris, no more Washington, D.C. Vladimir Solovyov, prominent Russian propagandist. When the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, to protect Russia and our people, we will use all the means at our disposal without reservation. This is not a bluff. Vladimir Putin, President of Russia. These are just some of the statements made by Russian officials and pundits since the start of the war in Ukraine. Some, like Medvedev and TV propagandists, make such nuclear threats regularly, but the most worrisome is that even Putin is not adverse to occasional nuclear brinksmanship. Just 3 days into the war, when it started becoming evident that this war would not be a short and victorious cakewalk, Putin ordered his nuclear deterrence forces into high alert. In February 2023, Putin announced that Russia suspended its participation in the START treaty with the US, which limits the number of strategic nuclear warheads. The deployment of nuclear weapons in Belarus can also be considered an escalatory step by Russia. Only one country globally, North Korea, regularly makes nuclear threats, but everyone is now used to this. Russian pundits and propagandists have never shied away from talking about the use of nuclear weapons. Still, Putin doing this and taking steps to increase nuclear-related tension is a completely different story, which makes the threat appear more realistic. We need to answer several questions to understand whether this threat is real. First of all, what does the Russian doctrine on the use of nuclear weapons tell us about the probability of its use in Ukraine? On 2nd of June 2020, Russia updated its nuclear doctrine. The document set several red lines, the crossing of which may theoretically result in a nuclear strike. The most notable red lines are the aggression with conventional weapons against the Russian Federation when the very existence of the state is threatened, or attacks against critical governmental or military sites of the Russian Federation, disruption of which would undermine nuclear force response actions. Possession of credible information about the launch of ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons, and other weapons of mass destruction targeting Russia and its allies, incapacitation of Russian nuclear forces, preventing them from making a retaliatory strike, and so on. The newest edition of the doctrine includes the concept of escalation for de-escalation, which means using nuclear deterrence to prevent escalation of military operations and their conclusion on terms unsuitable for Russia. Now, suppose Russia decides to launch a nuclear strike. In that case, it may argue that it is following its nuclear doctrine by escalating to de-escalate in order to achieve favorable terms in the war in Ukraine. So in theory, the doctrine allows Russia to use nuclear weapons in the state it is currently finding itself, but the same could be said of any conventional war that a nuclear power may find itself losing or not winning. The doctrine itself is a theoretical document, and without confidence that a nuclear strike would solve the war in Russia's favor, and that it is prepared for any Western retaliation, a nuclear strike is highly unlikely. Does the Kremlin have this confidence now? Arguably, it does not. Let's examine the Russian nuclear arsenal and its potential nuclear weapons use options to understand why a nuclear strike by Russia is unlikely. Russia is estimated to have some 6,000 nuclear weapons, which can be launched with its land-based, submarine-based, and plane-based missiles. The power of these weapons varies too, from several hundred kilotons to warheads of 10 to 100 kilotons. To compare, the nuclear bomb that destroyed Hiroshima and killed around 140,000 people had a yield of 15 kilotons. Modern nuclear weapons are significantly more powerful and destructive. The US Defense Intelligence Agency assessed Russia to have 1,000 to 2,000 tactical or non-strategic nuclear warheads in 2021. The US-Russia arms control agreements, like SALT, SORT, and START, classify any non-strategic nuclear weapon as a tactical nuclear weapon. Usually nuclear weapons with lower yields, up to 150 to 300 kilotons, which are supposedly suitable for use on the battlefield, are classified as tactical nuclear weapons. While most analysts believe that the Russian use of nuclear weapons is unlikely, using a tactical warhead is considered a more realistic option. What options does Russia have if Putin indeed decides to make a nuclear strike? First, Russia could strike an uninhabited area somewhere in the Arctic or the Black Sea if they intend to make a nuclear strike somewhere closer to Ukraine. Russia may choose this option to demonstrate its resoluteness to pursue its goals in Ukraine until the end, no matter what, while avoiding catastrophic human suffering and retaliation from the West. It would also show that the Kremlin would not fear using a nuclear bomb first. But although a demonstrative strike on, say, the Black Sea would be terrifying, it will not bring Russia anywhere closer to victory. Such an attack would not have any tangible impact on the battlefield, but it may provoke a retaliatory strike from the West, most probably through conventional means, and cause the ire of countries in neighboring Turkey, Georgia, and Bulgaria, which the Kremlin probably sees as less hostile countries. Second is launching a tactical nuclear weapon on the Ukrainian military defenses. It would devastate Ukrainian forces and infrastructure in the strike area, but would also harm Russian soldiers stationed nearby. Even lower yield nuclear weapons will cause significant radiation and destruction. Russia wants to capture positions currently held by Ukrainians and annex them into Russia, but any nuclear strike would make large swaths of territories uninhabitable for years to come. Using cruise missiles and artillery against enemy positions would make much more sense. This brings us to the third option, which is extremely unlikely for similar reasons. Russia may launch a tactical or strategic nuclear bomb on Kyiv to destroy the capital, decapitate the state, and force Ukrainians into submission. This move would be highly shocking, would cause harm not only to Ukraine, but to all neighboring countries, including Russia and its units fighting in Ukraine, and would certainly cause a retaliatory strike by the West, which is why it is unlikely. The fourth option, striking a NATO city, which Russian propagandists regularly propose, is the least likely option, as it does not yield any meaningful advantages for Russia and would most certainly cause a nuclear response from NATO and a short and humanity-ending nuclear war. So, none of the above described somewhat realistic options for using nuclear weapons by Russia bring tangible benefits to the Kremlin in its quest to win in Ukraine. Some options would lead to collateral damage, others would result in a swift response from the West. Ukraine's Western allies have already publicly, and through closed channels, warned Russia about the heavy consequences of Russia's use of nuclear weapons. The EU Foreign Policy Chief Borrell stated, "Any nuclear attack against Ukraine will create an answer, not a nuclear answer, but such a powerful one from the military side that the Russian army will be annihilated." The NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg expressed that even the use of smaller nuclear weapons would almost certainly bring NATO into the war directly. The former CIA chief Petraeus has said that the US and NATO retaliation to a Russian nuclear strike would take out every Russian conventional force that we can see and identify on the battlefield in Ukraine and also in Crimea and every ship in the Black Sea. The common theme of these warnings is that the West would respond with a conventional military force to cripple the Russian army, which is a sign that they view nuclear retaliation as absolutely the last resort. Western and Ukrainian officials have also reportedly stated that the Russian nuclear strike is highly unlikely. In October 2022, Pentagon Chief Lloyd Austin said that he did not see anything indicating that Russians may do that. The UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace reiterated this opinion, assessing this turn of events as highly unlikely. In January 2023, the Ukrainian military intelligence chief Kirill Budanov called the Russian nuclear posturing a scare tactic, stating that a nuclear strike was not going to happen. He predicted that a nuclear strike would result in not just a military defeat for Russia, but the collapse of Russia, and they know this very well. So, Ukrainian and Western officials have consistently downplayed the Russian nuclear threat. They believe that Putin, his officials, and propagandists use this rhetoric as blackmail to force the West to stop supporting Ukraine and break the Ukrainian resolve to fight. But it is not just the West warning Russia against a nuclear strike, but also the Kremlin's ally, China. The Financial Times reports that during their meeting in March 2023, Xi Jinping cautioned Putin against using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Seems very logical, since China would not want to risk a nuclear war in the world for Putin's dubious goals in Ukraine. Would Putin risk losing his main ally in the fight against the West by launching a nuclear weapon on Ukraine? It seems highly unlikely. Furthermore, it has been implied by Western officials that their intelligence would be able to see nuclear preparations by Russia if any had been going on, and they would not shy away from alarming the world about it in order to exert international pressure to stop these preparations. The Russian specialists on this topic describe the procedure of deployment of nuclear weapons as follows. Russian nuclear warheads are produced in Rosatom plants in the Urals and then given to the 12th Chief Department of the Ministry of Defense. The Russian nuclear forces have 12 arsenals where nuclear warheads are stored and maintained. Every 10 to 15 years, nuclear warheads are sent back to Rosatom plants to conduct repair and modification works. While some strategic nuclear weapons are connected to missiles ready for a strike at launch sites and strategic submarines, in peacetime, all tactical nuclear weapons are stored in nuclear depots. Their launch sites are in different places, and you would have to physically transport a tactical nuclear weapon and install it on a missile. It creates a long chain of people needing to affirm the use of nuclear weapons. The president has to order a strike, which is confirmed by the Minister of Defense and the Chief of Staff, who then pass the order to the Chief of the 12th Department, commanders and officers of nuclear depots, and military bases hosting launch sites. It is a long chain which is visible to Western intelligence, and which then may collapse by the insubordination of a single person. It is not unlikely for Russian officers to reject this order, not wanting to end up in history as individuals who started a nuclear war. The chain for the use of a strategic nuclear weapon is shorter. It is claimed that the president would have to give an unblocking code of a strategic nuclear weapon through a nuclear briefcase, which is then confirmed by the Minister of Defense and the Chief of Staff. Then the signal goes to a dedicated structure of the army, which is passed on to the specific unit in possession of a nuclear warhead. Still, this chain is long enough for Western intelligence to detect, which presumably has eyes on the Russian nuclear installations. So far, Western governments have reported no such movement, and it is unlikely that they would have hidden that. The reasons we discussed above are known to the Russian government, and even Putin himself has rejected the possibility of striking Ukraine with nuclear weapons. At a conference of international foreign policy experts in October 2022, Putin said in reference to this, "We see no need for that, there is no point in that, neither political nor military." He added that the statements about the use of nuclear weapons are merely in response to Western statements and provocations. Putin understands that any attempted nuclear strike would lead to an unpredictable escalation for him. His subordinates may back down from fulfilling his order to avoid any personal responsibility for taking such a disastrous step. This by itself is an internal political risk for Putin. He also understands that NATO would respond to any nuclear strike. If a strategic nuclear weapon is used on any NATO country, the response would probably be nuclear, which would mean the end of the world as we know it. Any use of tactical nuclear weapons on Ukraine would lead to a Western retaliation with conventional military means, which Western officials promised to be devastating for the Russian military. Neither option would bring Putin any closer to victory in Ukraine. Even his main ally China has made several strong statements about the inadmissibility of a nuclear strike. While even talking about nuclear weapons has long been considered a taboo in geopolitics, the fact that Putin and his entourage are engaged in nuclear brinksmanship means crossing another line. If there is one person in the world who even thinks about using a nuclear weapon, it is Vladimir Putin, and it rightly scares everyone. But is he actually going to do that? It is extremely unlikely for the vast array of reasons, ranging from a massive retaliation by the West to the limited benefit of using a tactical nuclear warhead on Ukraine. We hope you have learned some new insights from this episode and have given us a thumbs up. To make sure you don't miss any future episodes, please make sure you're subscribed and have pressed the bell button, which is currently housed in a nuclear storage bunker awaiting possible deployment. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. As we think about the Cold War and its legacy, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.